Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So today we are into truth, meaning and knowledge, basically. And those are the three sections that I've divided this video up into. There's quite a bit of work, quite a bit of material to get through, so we'll just jump straight into the first section, which is truth. Okay, so there is no truth. There you go, I said it. There is no truth. If truth is understood to be singular, universal, and eternal. That's basically the idea here. There is no truth. And it's tempting to argue with this straight away that, well, there are truths, right? There are things that are true. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, for example. Millions of lives were lost in World War II, and so on and so forth. But first of all, it's important to, I think, distinguish between facts and truth. This isn't out of Derrida, actually. This is just my own thoughts on this. But it seems that at the very beginning, it's important that we do make this distinction between facts and truth, because I think a lot of people, when they first encounter this notion, there's no such thing as truth, or there are multiple truths, or something along these lines. This is what we think of. Well, wait a minute, there are things that are true, but the things that people often think must be true and are therefore truths are actually facts. So although this isn't a distinction that Derrida makes, that I'm aware of, or that I've read him making, it's an important distinction that we need to make. And so I distinguish between facts and truth. A fact is just something that has happened. A fact is just what has happened. For example, the church created an index of prohibited books. That's a fact. It's not a truth. It's just a fact. There's no meaning associated with it. It tells us on its own, that fact tells us nothing about whether the church was a force for good or a force for evil, or whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. It doesn't give us any meaning. On its own, it's just a neutral report of something that's happened. That's what a fact is. A truth, on the other hand, is, and this is the word I use to describe this, it's a narrative that uses facts and incorporates them into a story that has meaning, that tells us, that has some substantial content to it, tells us something interesting, something that we might agree with or disagree with, something that is goes beyond just the mere reporting of facts. So the truth that you might associate with the fact of the church creating an index of prohibited books might be that the church stifled free thought and progress. And the fact that they created the index is used to support that truth, that narrative. So facts are just what has happened, and they lack meaning. Truths, on the other hand, use facts in a narrative, and they contain meaning. I wrote an article about this, which doesn't reference Derrida. I think I mentioned postmodernism once, but just on this distinction between facts and truth. I'll put a link to that article in the description box. But yeah, it's just something that, if you're interested, it's there. But I think straight from the outset, it's important that we distinguish between facts and truth, just so that we know what Derrida is talking about, or what I'm talking about when I say, for Derrida, there is no truth, as in singular, universal, eternal propositions. So, okay, to understand what Derrida's getting at here, I think we need to begin with what I'll call the historical period or a culture. And I'll refer to these quite a bit in this video. So we'll start with this historical period or culture. Every historical period or culture has a certain set of beliefs, norms, traditions, customs. If we can maybe even use a Merleau-Ponty word here, a style of thinking that's associated with a period or a culture. And all of these things affect the systems of significations that people in these periods or cultures use to think and communicate in. So, for example, if I give you the question, if I ask someone, what is a book made of? If we were to ask someone that in the past, perhaps in a pre-scientific era, what's a book made of? A likely answer would be pages or paper, maybe. But now, in the modern scientific era, the era of even scientific reductionism, a plausible answer someone might give you to that question, what is a book made of, would be atoms. Something that maybe in a prior era, that kind of answer was just unthinkable. But in the era that we live in now, this is, obviously it would depend on the context in which you're asking the question, but that answer is now on the table. It's something you might expect someone to say in response to this question. But even both of those forms of answers, what's a book made of, paper or atoms, they both betray a kind of a physical bias, right? What about someone who might answer a book is made of ideas? That's another possible answer. Probably not one we would expect in our era, but it's one that we could imagine people giving as an answer to that question, right? And no single one of these is true, right? And no one of them is truer than any of the others. They're all equally true answers to this question, but they vary depending on the times in which the question was asked, the style of thinking of the people to whom you're asking this question. So a historical period or culture refers to a community with a specific system of signification. And since these different historical periods or cultures have different systems of signification, and each system of signification reflects the style of thinking of that period or culture, including beliefs, values, customs, etc., the truths of each period or culture will also differ. So truth then is relative to the historical period or culture. And obviously relativism is a fairly frequent criticism of postmodernism and Derrida. But we'll come back to this idea in just a moment, because it's not the be all and end all of truth here. So we've got the historical period or culture, and the system of significations, the systems of signification that make up each of those, and the relativity that sets up within those different periods or cultures. And this brings us then to epoch, the epoch. And basically, for Derrida, this just seems to be, I would say, a broader, more inclusive notion than, say, a historical period or a culture. Broader in the sense that it spans multiple historical periods and cultures and kind of unites them in a certain way. It gives them a common grounding. And that means with this, for Derrida, the epoch that we currently live in is the epoch of the sign. the principal character of which is the use of signs or a system of signification in reading, writing, and thinking. And that's quite important too. So we're in the epoch of the sign, but it's important to understand that this isn't bad. This isn't a negative thing, Derrida is saying. We need some system of signification if we are going to have language, if we are going to communicate ideas to other people. So without some kind of system of signification, there could be no society in the first place. Given this, Derrida says, it would be somewhat foolish to conclude from its belonging to an epoch that it is necessary to move on to something else and to get rid of the sign of this term and this notion. To perceive the gesture we are sketching here appropriately, the expressions epoch, closure of an epoch, historical genealogy must be understood in a new way, and they must first be withdrawn from all relativism. So I think that, for me, that's quite an important quote. The fact that the sign belongs to an epoch, so it's just, we can kind of pigeonhole it in this, in a kind of, in an era, in a fixed, we can give it a fixed historical point of reference. Just that mere fact is not a reason to get rid of it. It doesn't suggest that we should then try and move on, for example, to the next epoch, that where this epoch is somehow inferior to an epoch that might come later. So we should look to move beyond it. That would be somewhat foolish, Derrida says, just because we need signs. We need those signs in order to be able to communicate, to have language, and perhaps even to have higher thought, higher cognition. However, in that quote, Derrida says we need to reevaluate what we mean by epoch, closure of an epoch, and historical genealogy. And specifically, he says they must all be withdrawn from all relativism. And so this ties in with what I said earlier about the system of signification, the systems of signification between different historical periods or cultures being relative. Now we have Derrida saying the epoch must be withdrawn from relativism. We don't want to associate this with relativism. So an epoch is different from what I called historical periods or cultures. And it's different in the sense that it unites historical periods or cultures together under their reliance on a system of signification. So this then, the epoch of the sign, is not relative. So within this non-relative epoch, we have smaller historical periods or cultures which are relative, which do have a relative systems of signification. But the fact that they all have systems of signification, that is what is not relative. And that's what unites them into this broader epoch. And just a little bit more from that quote, there Derrida talks about the closure of an epoch. And I wanted and this kind of ties in with what I was just saying. Regarding this, at another point in the book, Derrida says, maybe the epoch of the sign will never end, but its historical closure is, however, designated. And that, I think, just sums up what I was just trying to say. The epoch of the sign will maybe never end because we need signs. We need a system of signification to communicate, to think, to read and write, all of those society, right? Society, in order to have a society, a functioning culture, we need signs. So maybe that will never end, but the historical closure is designated. And I take this to refer I take this as referring to what I called historical period or a culture. So within the epoch of the sign, there are these local, if you like, boundaries or closures, and they mark specific individual systems of signification, or, to use that word again, styles of thinking. So that's our epoch. And I think there are two key defining features of the epoch of the sign. The first one is Logocentrism. And I've got a quote to start us off with this. Thus, within this epoch, reading and writing, the production or interpretation of signs, the text in general as fabric of signs, allow themselves to be confined within secondariness. A truth or a meaning already constituted by and in the element of the Logos precede them. So being in the epoch of the sign, that is to say, conforming to a system of signification, which is exactly what Logos is. Remember, Logos means law or reason governed. So reason is basically that idea of adhering to a set of laws, a set of rules about something, and in this case about how we communicate, the words that we use, the concepts that make up our discourse. So that's what Logos is, and the fact that we are in this logocentric period, which is the epoch of the sign, has basically two consequences, I think. The first one, I think it's not a necessary consequence here. So this is a contingent consequence, restriction or consequence at least. And this is that the idea of truth itself. So the idea that there is one universal, eternal, transcendental signified that stands outside any system of it stands outside as a system of signifiers, and it gives us a fixed locus from which we can derive meaning, a kind of fixed, certain meaning. That idea of truth is itself part of a system of signification, i.e. a signifier referring to another signified. So essentially, the point there is that we've created this concept as a part of our system of signification, the systems of signs that we use. But in creating it, we've defined it as pre-existent. We've defined it as something eternal, universal, singular, uncreated, something that stands outside this arena in which we can, this system within which we play. For Derrida, this is a system of signification. There's meaning is being created. It's dynamic, and it's characterized by, as we know, difference, but also play. So we understand truth to be outside that, something which is fixed, something which gives us a clear reference point, and something outside this relative system where nothing is necessarily eternal, nothing is necessarily universal. And that's how we've defined it, and that's how it fits into our system of signification. But the important thing is, it is just a part of that system of signification. It doesn't actually exist outside the rest of the signifiers. It is there is no outside to that system of signifiers. It's all signifiers. And basically the idea is that we've forgotten that truth is just another concept. It's just another concept with no more validity or legitimacy or transcendence than any other concept in the system of significations that belong to our historical period or culture. Thus, truth is not singular, eternal, universal. But it's very difficult to kind of step back from that, the signs that we use, and recognize that these aren't eternal and fixed. We think when we're talking, we think we're using concepts that transcend our era. But this is almost always a mistake, I think. And that example, what is a book made of? The way we answer that question has multiple answers depending on how you think, depending on depending on the culture in which you live, the values, all of the norms, the customs, all of those things, that style of thinking. And this goes to things like politics as well. What's the best form of government, perhaps? These things all, again, we think there is a one best answer. But if you look at different historical periods, that one best answer has always been different, and it's going to be different in the future, perhaps. But we have this notion that the way that we think now is the correct way. We've got the truth that people in the past didn't understand, and the way that we think now is going to continue on forever into the future if people remain reasonable and sensible. But it's almost like so truth is essentially historical then. That's the idea. But we forget that. We think that the propositions that we make, the concepts that we use, we think that these are somehow eternal, that these transcend our historical period. And it's a difficult illusion to shake, but that's what Derrida is suggesting here. So that was the first consequence there of being in the epoch of the sign. The idea of truth itself is part of a system of signification. The second consequence is that, and this one I think is necessary. It's not contingent. In conforming to a specific system of signification of a particular historical period or culture, this necessarily means that one will be utilizing concepts determined by one's historical period or culture. Hence, the truths or the meanings that one finds will have already been, if not determined, they will at least have had their outlines, their broad outlines mapped by that historical period or culture, by the system of signification that is being used at that time. So reading and writing then, as Derrida says in that quote, are secondary, and the truths that they indicate will already have been constituted by the logos that precedes them, by the system of signification within which they are arising. And so it's always important to be able to step back out of one's place, out of one's point in time, out of one's point in the society or culture that one lives in, and that gives you that perspective to see how that system of signification that you are bound up in is affecting you, is influencing you. Therefore, again, here, truth is not singular, universal, or eternal. So that's logocentrism. That's the first of the two defining features that I think make up the epoch of the sign. The second is phonocentrism. And so this is connected, obviously, with the voice, speech. And I'll start this little section off with a quote as well. The voice is heard, understood, closest to the self as the absolute effacement of the signifier. It is the unique experience of the signified producing itself spontaneously from within the self. This experience of the effacement of the signifier and the voice is not merely one illusion among others, since it is the condition of the very idea of truth, but we will show elsewhere in what it is self-deceived. This deception is the history of truth. So in speaking, more so than in writing, the signifier is completely effaced. And by that I think Derrida means we don't hear, and we've talked about this before, we don't hear individual words, the signifiers. Rather, we immediately go beyond them to the signifieds, to the concepts behind them. And this means that what we experience in speech is only the signified. The signified, as Derrida says, producing itself spontaneously. That's how it appears. Moreover, we feel that it's being produced from within ourselves. So the link again to consciousness, inwardness, breath, spirit, all of those terms that connect there. So this is how we view, we understand what we're doing when we overemphasize speech. It creates this illusion, and then we have this belief that we have this experience of the signified producing itself spontaneously. And this experience then covers over the fact that we are thinking or speaking within the bounds of a specific system of signification, which is specific to our historical period or culture. So it obscures that fact for us. We no longer notice the fact that we are talking using signifiers that refer to signifieds, and this covers over that idea that signifiers are referring to other signifieds, which are also signifiers referring to other signifieds. It covers over this notion that there is no external point, there is no fixed reference point outside this system of signification, which can anchor a meaning or a truth for us. So the belief that we are dealing directly with signifieds, which comes on the back of the experience of the effacement of the signifier, is thus an illusion. But it's not just another illusion. It's not just one illusion among many, because this illusion is the condition of the idea of truth. So in believing that we're dealing directly with signifieds or concepts themselves, i.e. independent of that signifier-signified relations, imagining we're outside that boundary within which signifiers refer to other signifieds, and believing that we have direct kind of touch with signifieds or concepts, this obscures from us the fact that we're operating within a relative system of signification. That's the illusion. But it's compounded, or it's raised to another level by the fact that this illusion predisposes us to believe in singular, eternal, universal truths, in the form of the signifieds or concepts that we believe we are dealing with directly, that we believe are producing themselves spontaneously from out of ourselves. And so phonocentrism there contributes to this illusion of a singular, eternal, universal truth. And that's truth. So I want to move into the second part of the video now, which is meaning and non-meaning. So although we've seen there is no single, eternal, universal truth, there is, however, such a thing as meaning or sense. And regarding this, Derrida says discourse always carries its meaning within itself. So to make a sentence is just to manifest a possible meaning. And Derrida goes further to say, by its essence, the sentence is normal. It carries normality within itself, that is sense. And the normal here is Derrida uses an opposition to madness, and this idea, this dichotomy between the normal, the normalcy of a sentence, which is its sense, which is its meaning, in opposition to the abnormality of madness, brings us to non-meaning. And the idea with this is that the ground of meaning or sense is actually non-meaning, which in reference to what Derrida calls the economy of reason, he describes non-meaning as its element, its milieu, its unlimiting boundaries of nonsense. He also describes it as the baselessness of the non-meaning from which the basis of meaning is drawn. So these reversals are important. These reversals or dichotomies are important here. Meaning being grounded in non-meaning, sense being grounded in nonsense, base grounded in baselessness. And the basic idea here, I think, is that nonsense or non-meaning is like a background or milieu out of which the sense or the meaning can arise. And I've talked about this idea a lot in the Deleuze series. That comes up in Difference and Repetition as a fairly fundamental idea, but it's here in Derrida as well. And I quite like this, actually, the moving beyond meaning or sense and looking to see how it can arise, what it comes from, looking to find that origin and finding that it's not necessarily in positivity. It's not positivity all the way down. It's not sense all the way down or meaning all the way down. When you go down far enough, you find its opposite is actually at the core. So there are a few different ways that non-meaning operates as a ground for meaning, and I think these will help clarify this idea a little bit. The first is the unconscious. So obviously in relation to consciousness, the unconscious is like an absence, right? An absence of consciousness, and consciousness is defined as a presence, a self-awareness. So we have that dichotomy again. And Derrida talks about meaning being reconstituted through deferral after the subterranean toil of an impression, which left a trace that has never been perceived, a meaning that has never been lived in the present i.e. a meaning that has never been conscious. And he's talking there about a repressed memory becoming a trauma only after the event. So those key ideas of deferral and trace are both appearing there for Derrida. And again, that idea that it's not enough to just understand consciousness as the presence, the full presence of self-awareness all the way down. There is this deeper layer of unconsciousness, which is productive itself, which has a generative role in the presence of consciousness. So it's that, again, that absence that is productive. And obviously trauma, repressed memories and trauma is a fairly extreme example, but I think the point holds for in more ordinary situations as well. The general point is that there's more going on than just this the presence of consciousness, that the presence of that self-awareness. There is this other side to that consciousness, which is hidden, repressed, unconscious. Another way that this non-meaning operates, we can see non-meaning operating as a ground for meaning, is through these words: absence, silence, excess, and madness. So with respect to writing, Derrida uses each of these words to capture the productive milieu of non-meaning that grounds meaning. So he talks about the absence of a work in opposition to the presence of a text. And this, I think, is a little like the blank page, which is necessary before one can write anything. Not obviously literally, and not obviously as nothing or complete emptiness, but a blank page as the fertility of possibility. And it's that absence that is productive for what will eventually be the presence of the text. Silence as well. He talks about silence in opposition to expression or literary expression. And the same as with absence in a work. It's a kind of quietness in which something can be said. But again, not a quietness in the sense of nothingness, emptiness, but there's a potentiality there. There's no thing as in, there's nothing as in no particular thing, but that's a fertile ground from which something can be said. Excess is interesting, and this should be understood in opposition to totality. So the excess is in the direction of the non-determined. So the nothingness, understood in the right way, or infinity. These are other words that Derrida uses. The direction of the non-determined, overflowing all totalities as their ground. Again, we've got that sense of a background milieu, which isn't anything yet, because it's only against this background that something can arise. So that you've got the totality, and this can include even the systems of signification that we use, right? That's a totality. But there's an excess around that, out of which that system of signification can arise, out of which that system, which includes meaning, which includes sense, that can only arise out of this, an excess around it that has We'll talk about how actually in a minute, but that is productive in such a way that system of meaning is able to arise within it. And all of this leads to a very different understanding of what a thing is. So the present, the spoken or written, or the total object is the way that this nothing or absence is determined by disappearing, disguising its origin at the same time. And that, I think, is a really important idea. The present, spoken, written, total object is the way this nothing or absence is determined by disappearing. And as it disappears, it disguises its origin at the same time. Two things to note about that. First, the way the nothing is determined. So the absent becomes present. The silence becomes discourse. And this phrasing puts the non-meaning first. So it means that the object, the thing, is not primarily defined by positivity, but by absence, by lack, by negativity. And it's just a different way of understanding what something is, what an object is. It isn't pure positivity all the way down. It doesn't arise out of pure positivity. There is this absence, this nothing, and the thing, rather than being pure positivity all the way from the ground up, is actually just the disappearance of that absence or nothingness. It's the way that the absence or nothingness fades, that indeterminacy becomes determined. That is what makes an object or a thing. And the second part of that idea, the nothing is determined by disappearing, means that this disappearance, what is disappearing, the absence or the silence, is always necessarily hidden or disguised. We never see it because it's invisible. All we see is the positivity of the thing. But the fact that it came about through the disappearance of the absence, that is always covered over in the thing itself. All that's visible is the visible thing. What's left invisible is the way that thing came into being, which is the becoming determinate of that original indeterminacy. It's that becoming present of that original absence, that becoming heard of that original silence. And Derrida also calls this madness in opposition to the normal, to normal reasonable thought, in the sense that it represents the infinite possibility which exceeds all that is real, factual, or existent. So madness there tied in with excess. There's an infinite possibility beyond what is considered normal. A sentence, a proposition with normal meaning. There's that sentence conforms to the system of signification that you live in, that you breathe in, that you think within. So madness is like a way to, what I described earlier as trying to step back out of that system to see it for what it is, to get a different perspective on it. And so that's why Derrida talks about madness there. So certainty, or discourse, or presence, or truth, or rationality is only achieved within indeterminacy, silence, absence, or madness. But there is a caveat here, and that is that don't forget that in favoring absence, madness, silence, excess, and so on and so forth, Derrida isn't picking one traditional metaphysical opposition over the other. Instead, he's trying to go beyond these oppositions. So the absence that I've been talking about is not an absence in contrast to a presence. It's not an absence defined by a presence which would be its opposite. The silence that we're talking about is not a silence in relation to a discourse. It's a productive absence and a productive silence. So it's a different kind of thing. It's moving beyond those traditional metaphysical dichotomies to an originative source for those metaphysical oppositions. Cool. So this brings us to the third part of the video, which is knowledge. So regarding knowledge, knowledge is for Derrida wholly reducible to signification. Basically, knowledge is nothing more than a system of signs, and Derrida says the thing itself is a sign. And that's interesting to think about. The thing itself is a sign. So we're not dealing with say physical objects which are external to us. There's a whole metaphysical picture there that Derrida's circumventing. The thing is nothing more than a sign. And this is essentially Charles Peirce's phenomenology, which Derrida contrasts to Husserl's, in that for Peirce, manifestation itself does not reveal a presence, it makes a sign. Again, the idea here, we're very much opposed to any kind of what we might call objective realism. The idea that there are things that exist external to us, independent of us. A thing for us is just a sign. And that's as much and as far as we can it's as much as we can say and as far as we can go in talking about things. So for something to manifest or appear is not for a solid something to present itself, rather it's for a signifier to be generated. And a signifier is not that kind of thing. Rather, it represents that kind of thing. So the quote I have for this, the so-called thing itself is always already a representamen, escaping the simplicity of intuitive evidence. The representamen functions only by generating an interpretant that itself becomes a sign, and so on to infinity. The self-identity of the signified conceals and displaces itself unceasingly. The property of the representamen is to be itself and another, to be produced as a structure of redirection, to be sidetracked from itself. The property of the representamen is not to be proper, that is to say, absolutely proximate to itself. The represented is always already a representamen. So representamen there, in that quote, is just that which represents something else. And the interpretant is the effect that a sign has on the person who sees or hears it. And the effect that it has is to produce in that person another sign that refers to a represented. So with that cleared up, the bottom line is that we never see a thing itself. Rather, we always see a representation. What always appears or manifests is a representation. Not for Cartesian reasons, because, say, the mind is separate from matter, nor for Heideggerian reasons, because things appear in a referential totality aligned with our projects, but because we're in the epoch of the sign, in which things always appear in a system of signification. And we're never outside that. We're always dealing with signifiers, and those signifiers refer to signifieds, which are themselves signifiers. So seeing the representation or hearing the representation necessarily generates an interpretation in the seer or the hearer. And this is an interpretation which is itself another sign. We're never getting outside this system. So the representation is itself and another. That's what that's what Derrida says in that quote. It is itself and another because it redirects us onto the signified. So it is a signifier in and of itself, if you like. But as a signifier, its job is to redirect us onto something else. So it is itself, but it's also another. It has a kind of, we could call it like a kind of hybrid existence as what it is, but also as what it isn't. And the represented, the signified, is always already a representamen, a signifier. So there's that endless chain of reference. And that's all coming from that quote, all connected with Charles Peirce's phenomenology, as Derrida sees it. And so that's knowledge. I've got one last quote for you before we look at a summary, which hopefully kind of ties this all together. If words and concepts receive meaning only in sequences of differences, one can justify one's language and one's choice of terms only within a topic and an historical strategy. The justification can therefore never be absolute and definitive. It corresponds to a condition of forces and translates an historical calculation. So basically, meaning arises from sequences of differences. It's therefore always limited to a particular topic or historical strategy, i.e. the system of signification that encompasses the beliefs, values, norms of a culture or a period. So there is no absolute or definitive truth, because we're always operating within this system of signification, which is itself relative to other systems of signification, and as a system of signification is always bound up within its own sphere. It never has. At no point do we get outside of this system to anything like a transcendental signified, a truth which could anchor any of the thoughts that we have within this system. Cool. So, my summary. So starting with truth, basically there are no singular, universal or eternal truths. And here I made a point of distinguishing between facts as what's happened, which have no meaning, and truth as a meaningful narrative. Truth, then, we saw was always relative to a historical period or culture. And this brought us to the epoch of the sign. And essentially, this is just the necessary requirement that we think within systems of signification. And so because this is necessary, because it's foundational, it's not relative. It spans all historical periods and cultures as that which enables them in the first place, as that which allows them to exist, brings them about in the first place. Without language, without this kind of signification, it's difficult to see how cultures or civilizations or societies could have formed in the first place. And the epoch of the sign there were two main features of this epoch. The first was logocentrism. So reading and writing and thinking must conform to a system of signification, i.e., and this is the logos, right? So in order to conform to such a system, they must be closed off from the milieu, from that non-meaning out of which they arose. That's kind of what defines logocentrism as being, and defines the epoch of the sign, being bound to this particular system of signification. So as a consequence of logocentrism, we have the idea that truth is itself just another signifier. So it's not universal, singular, eternal. It's just another part of that system. And in addition to that, truth or meaning is shaped by that system of signification. So again, we're not getting outside the system. There is no transcendental signified to be had here, which we could call truth, which we could call an absolute capital M meaning, if you like. The other defining feature of the epoch of the sign was phonocentrism, and this meant that the idea behind this is that speech effaces the signifier, and this leads us to feel that we're dealing with true concepts. It creates the illusion that we are not within this signified system, that we're somehow dealing with things that transcend that transcend our historical period and our time and our style of thinking. So we talked about this being an illusion, but also not like any other illusion, because this is the illusion that generates the notion of a truth in the first place, capital T truth. Then we looked at meaning and non-meaning. So meaning, discourse always carries meaning within itself. That was clear. Derrida is definitely not against meaning or sense. But non-meaning was important too. Non-meaning as the milieu out of which meaning can arise. And we looked at some ways that this happens. We looked at the unconscious in opposition to consciousness, and absence, silence, excess, and madness, all in opposition to presence, discourse, totality, and rationality. And a really interesting idea that came out of that discussion was a new way of thinking about the object or the thing. So the object as the way the nothing is determined by disappearing, bringing that the absence, the non-meaning, the baselessness to the fore. And that just completely changes the way you think about how an object is formed and what an object is. Gives us an insight into the origin of the object or the thing. And finally, we came to knowledge. And knowledge is reducible to signification for Derrida. The thing itself is a sign. And we put this all in terms of representation and interpretation, such that representation generates an interpretation, which turns out to be another representation. So the point of all this was to underline the non-absolute character of meaning and truth. And that is us for today. Cool. So truth, meaning, and knowledge. In the next video, we'll kind of follow up on this. I think it's a natural extension of this discussion, and see what Derrida has to say about the philosopher Georges Batailleur, who I've mentioned a couple of times already in this series. But he has a lot to say about him and writing a difference, and we'll explore that in the next video. But that's where I'm going to finish up today. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it helped, and I'll catch you next time.